this episode of In Layman's Terms with Guy Nohra. What we do is we take complex issues, interpret them, analyze them, and report them to our audience while using common sense. Our guest today is Charles Cornish Dale. Charles, I'm very excited about this episode, and I'm going to tell you why at the beginning. I'm going to spoil the whole excitement of this. So first of all, the journey is incredibly important to me, and I want to hear about your journey and specifically how we go from a doctorate in Oxford in philosophy to where we are today. So that, and you can start at any point that you want. I
Sure.
also want to talk about nutrition. I want to talk a little bit about muscle building and biohacking, longevity, and then whatever else comes along, we're going to talk about. So that's what I know it's a very open-ended, but I can promise you it'll make sense at the end.
Fantastic. Well, I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
So tell me about the journey. You can start any time, but of course we will have to talk a little bit about a doctorate in philosophy and how that ends up being into writing books on nutrition, especially eggs.
Yeah. Well, it was a doctorate at Oxford in medieval history, so it wasn't quite philosophy, but it was. I was writing about the Reformation, about this great religious change that took place in Europe at the end of the Middle Ages, beginning of the early modern period. Looking at religious change, looking at Latin, medieval Latin records, and it was really fascinating stuff and stuff that I've been interested in for a very long time. But
amazing times, interesting times.
I actually think the Reformation is obviously one of the most important events in recent history. It's one of the defining events of the modern era. Defines the terms even actually, I think, in which we think. So many of the concepts and the kind of ways that we think have been determined by the kind of by the schism that took place, by the debates that took place among theologians, by political developments and social developments. So yeah, it's a really important thing, the Reformation. But I was at university for the better part of 10 years. I was at Cambridge before Oxford, and I read history and anthropology, and kind of moved around quite a bit and indulged my intellectual interests, which are quite wide, which are quite varied. But when I was finishing my PhD, or coming close to finishing my PhD at Oxford, I didn't really want to stay and become an academic. I kind of decided, look, actually, you know what? I don't think this is for me. I don't think I really fit in, and I'm not actually sure that I want to continue writing about the Reformation, because the thing is, you do a doctorate, and really that sets you up then for an academic career. Your interests are kind of determined by what you do when you do a PhD, not entirely, and over the course of an academic career you can branch out, move into new areas, but I would have been writing about the Reformation and continuing my PhD studies, and I didn't really want to do that. So anyway, I ended up being I took up a job I had done before in the literary industry, and was just doing that. And then the pandemic came along, and I was posting anonymously on Twitter as the Raw Egg Nationalist. So I have quite a deep background in health and fitness. I was always very fit. I a sportsman at school. I played football and rugby in the UK, and athletics and that kind of stuff. I took up martial arts in my mid to late teens. Was a kickboxer. Ended up teaching kickboxing and being quite heavily involved in martial arts. So I had a background in health and fitness, but then I really got into writing about health and fitness, and in particular the political implications of health and fitness today, as this anonymous character, this anonymous personage, the Raw Egg Nationalist. And things really started to take off in 2020. In the summer, I wrote a cookbook called Raw Egg Nationalism, and it was a mixture of recipes, many of which were sort of inspired by classic bodybuilding, and in particular by this chap, Vince Gironda, who was a real kind of bodybuilding maverick. He was Arnold Schwarzenegger's mentor, Frank Zane's mentor, taught a lot of the kind of golden age greats nutrition and exercise and all this kind of stuff. Had a gym in North Hollywood, not West Hollywood. So the cookbook had a sort of mixture of recipes, but also kind of political stuff in it as well. It was kind of like a sort of manifesto come cookbook. It's a strange thing, but it was a big hit, and
Okay.
that was really the start of that really kind of started to propel me. Then I was in a Tucker Carlson documentary in 2022 called The End of Men, about testosterone decline, the political implications of testosterone decline. RFK Jr. was in it with me. So, I mean, like the first half of the documentary really was RFK, and then the second half of the documentary was like 40 minutes, was me. It was about me. It was about this kind of movement that's called sort of right-wing bodybuilders, basically. It's people on the internet like me who are sort of resisting the kind of decay of the modern world and the kind of like laziness and ill health and kind of lassitude and actually trying to create like a more vigorous existence through working out and taking control of your diet and minimizing your contact with harmful endocrine disrupting substances, all these kind of toxic chemicals that are in the food and water and the environment more broadly. And I mean, the documentary was generated kind of sensational headlines, and there was a real kind of liberal backlash against it, against the suggestion that maybe health and fitness might be political, and also perhaps that actually, it might actually more exclusively be a province of the right than the left on the political spectrum today. And I've written more books since then. I wrote a book called The Eggs Benedict Option in 2022, which is about plant-based diets. It's about basically the global plan, or the plan for a global plant-based diet, and why that's a bad thing. Drawing some quite interesting and provocative analogies with the agricultural revolution in the Near East about 10,000 years ago, which was a transition from hunter-gatherer lifestyles to basically the first agricultural settlements, the first states and cities that were supported by agricultural laborers, by peasants, basically. And now I've just finished a new book called The Last Men: Liberalism and the Death of Masculinity, which is actually a follow-on from the Tucker Carlson documentary. It's about testosterone decline, the political implications of testosterone decline, and what we can do about it on an individual level, but also on a societal level as well. Whether there are things that need to be done. So it's kind of like a big tie-in in many ways with the Maha stuff, with the Robert F. Kennedy Junior agenda, and all of that kind of stuff. So I mean, my work is really, it was kind of a forerunner actually for a lot of this Maha stuff. And now Kennedy's, running HHS and things are very different, and it's looking like it was all quite prescient actually.
So that great summary. I'm gonna obviously start picking on some of the areas that you discussed. We're gonna push them further. But if I could start with your studies, so if you had a conclusion on the Reformation and what it meant to where we are today, what would you say about that?
I think that the Reformation fundamentally has determined the character of the modern world. So I mean, for example, the Reformation split Christendom. I mean, there was a very early schism in Christendom, or an earlier schism in Christendom between the Orthodox and what Catholic became the Catholic. But it was a much more fundamental schism in Europe. I mean, not just religiously, but also politically. So you have England becomes a Protestant nation, and whatever kind of antagonism that England had with the continent, with France, is magnified, and with Spain in particular, is magnified much more. And so you get this kind of, it sets England on its course, I think, to become a maritime power and then to become an empire. So there are big political ramifications. It's the beginning of the 30 Years' War, which is a big, inter Protestant Catholic war that ends up with the Treaty of Westphalia, which determines the which basically sets the political terms then for
Yep.
Europe as a Europe of states in the modern sense. Um, I mean, I don't actually think that there's really any aspect of modern life that isn't touched on by the Reformation, and certainly like the political nature of the modern world is determined by the forces that were unleashed by the Reformation. I mean, it was a very
Yep.
creative thing. You know, I mean, I think you have to understand America also too. You know, I mean, America is fundamentally an an
Sure.
English Protestant nation. I mean, the
Yep.
character of America is shaped by the forces unleashed by the Reformation. So
Yes.
I don't think that you can. It's not just about religion. I mean, it's about everything. Really, that's what I would say.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So just for our audience, Martin Luther came along. There were some
Mm.
theological changes that were being discussed, which people like me still don't quite understand. But it was a big deal because it did become political.
Mm.
And obviously in Germany, some of the princes decided to side with the Lutheran and
Mm.
Protestants, and things were happening in Switzerland, and of course England was probably the biggest one and the most fundamentally that changed things. And having have a European background, the French wars between the Huguenots and the
Mm.
Catholics. I mean, there was some really the night of Saint Bartholomew, etc. There's some really
Yep.
bad things that happened, folks, and it was civil war within the Western world, and Charles gave us a great description of it. So. And sometimes it did influence things going forward. And yes, the United States. I mean, people always talk. The reason why we have separation of state and church is because people were escaping
Mm.
religious prosecution
Mm.
overseas, persecution overseas. So, meaning in the continent, which was the world back then.
Mm.
So okay, so that's great, and then we're gonna touch in. So just so my background is in life sciences, so I spent my whole
Mm-hmm.
life investing in biotech and medtech, but at the same time, I played around a lot and my own biohacking, and
Mm.
started paying attention to diets because I'd see 20 diabetes companies, metabolic disease companies, and I think to myself, well, why are we developing these billion-dollar costing drugs when you can just watch your diet
Yeah.
as an individual? Of course, type ones can't help it, but type twos, which is
Mm.
really the
Mm.
majority of people today in the Western world, actually even more than the Western world, is pretty much
Mm.
everywhere now.
Yeah.
So tell me about the diet. I'm fascinated about I know your book was a mixture, and I'd love to hear about both, but just
Mm.
the diet. So most people uh, uh, at least they say that they're going to try very hard to follow a certain diet. And at the beginning of the
Mm.
year, everybody joins health clubs, and they there's an increase in the spending on healthy food. The outside aisles of the supermarket, the famous outside aisles of the supermarket, and then of course 9 months later, everybody's
Mm.
winter's coming, and okay, so tell me about this, and from your perspective, and how of an impact you have seen.
Well, so I mean, fundamentally, I would say that my approach to diet is an ancestral approach to diet. So I'm very influenced by the work of a chap called Weston A. Price, who was a dentist in the 19 sort of early 20th century in Cleveland, Ohio. He was actually Canadian, but he came and practiced in Ohio. And he wrote this amazing book. I think it's actually the best book on nutrition that's probably ever been written. It's called Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, and it was published in 1939. Uh,
1939 already.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's an amazing. It's a piece of anthropology, really. So Weston A. Price
Okay.
started. He had a dental practice, and he started noticing that more and more of his patients were displaying basically their faces were basically collapsing. That's what was happening. The structure of their faces, he noticed, was starting to collapse. It wasn't just that they had lots of cavities in their mouths, that their teeth weren't healthy. It was that actually their jaws weren't developing properly, their cheeks and noses and nasal passages weren't developing properly. And this was particularly marked in the children as well. So he noticed that particularly it was children whose faces weren't developing properly. And he hypothesized quite sensibly that it was something to do with diet. And the late 19th, early 20th century was when Americans really first started eating industrially produced foodstuffs.
Yeah.
So we're talking about, rather than eating locally produced whole foods, they're starting to eat foods that are made in factories, right? And that means refined wheat products in particular, sugar syrups, canned goods. These are like the first processed foods. I mean, they really are. Like these are the forerunners of the kind of processed foods that you see, the ultra processed foods that you see on the shelves today in supermarkets and convenience stores. So Weston A. Price thought, look, people are eating more and more of this food. I think it's having an effect. He was a very, very scientific-minded man, and so what he wanted to do is he wanted to establish a control to compare to his patients in Cleveland. And so he basically went on this globe-trotting adventure like an anthropologist with his wife to all sorts of different traditional societies in North America, in Africa, in Europe even. He went to the Shetland. He went to no, he didn't go to Shetland Islands. He went to the Scottish Highlands and Islands. He went to the high alpine valleys of Switzerland. He went to Australasia, to Polynesia, and encountered various different small-scale traditional societies eating their traditional diets, so untouched by Western convenience goods, by Western factory-produced refined foods. And what he discovered basically was that in these small-scale societies where they still cleaved to their traditional diet, then they displayed basically none of the signs of physical degeneration that he was encountering back in the US, in the Corn Belt. And although there were differences between the diets, as you would expect, there was a difference. There's obviously a difference between the diet of an Inuit and the diet of high alpine Swiss herder.
Sure.
Nevertheless, all of these different groups who were actually in perfect physical health, that's the phrase that he uses, perfect physical health, they all emphasized the consumption of nutrient-dense animal foods. So they all built their diets around dairy products, fatty cuts of meat, organ meat, eggs, seafood. So all of these different people, wherever they were in the world, whether they were in Fiji or whether they were in Arctic Canada, they were prioritizing their diets were built around nutrient-dense animal foods. And that's basically, Weston A. Price's conclusions about the necessity of eating nutrient-dense animal foods. That informs my entire approach. And of course, it's the opposite. It's the precise opposite of the advice that we've been given for at least the last 70 years, certainly since the end of the Second World War, which is to minimize consumption of animal products, minimize consumption of meat, minimize consumption of butter and dairy and milk, because it contains cholesterol. That's what cholesterol, saturated fat. That's the principal objection to consuming nutrient-dense animal foods, is that you're going to consume too much cholesterol, you'll get heart disease, you'll have a stroke or heart attack, and you'll die.
It's amazing. First, I think the book is something that everybody should know about. So I want to definitely make a note about that book that he wrote. Obviously, way ahead of his times. It took me, I don't know, maybe 10 to 15 years ago, I decided that food tech had moved much faster in evolution than our evolution as humans.
Yes.
And consequently, that's why we couldn't handle any of the things that are being thrown at us, and hence the metabolic disease epidemic that we have. And that was kind of my own conclusion back then, but yours is much more articulate and actually based on data from that gentleman.
Well, the thing about it, the thing I think you have to understand is that, we are the creatures we are because of our evolutionary history. And for the vast majority of human evolutionary history, we have been hunter-gatherers. The agriculture was invented and became a dominant social form in the last 10 to 12,000 years. We've been around for 200,000 years as modern humans, and hominins of various different kinds, our more distant ancestors, have been around for millions of years. I mean, there was an Israeli study that was done not that long ago that showed that actually some of our more distant relatives, non-modern humans, archaic hominins, consumed basically nothing but meat. They were hypercarnivores. That's the phrase that's used. They're hypercarnivores for 2 million years. So for 2 million years, our more distant ancestors ate basically 80% of their 80+% of their calories came from animals, right? So this has left a deep, deep imprint in us, in our DNA, in the way that our bodies are structured, in the structure of our mouths and our teeth, in the structure of our digestive system, in the way that our metabolism works, in our basic nutritional needs. I mean, there have been adaptations to the agricultural revolution, to the changes brought about by the agricultural revolution, and certainly, in populations that have the longest history of grain consumption, then we're discovering now, then there are specific genetic adaptations that allow, better digestion of grains, greater tolerability of gluten, for example, which can cause a lot of people problems. But actually, the vast majority of the world's population, their ancestors only started consuming grains within the last couple of thousand years. And that's even true for Europe. There are populations like the Germans, I've written about the ancient Germans. The Roman historian Tacitus, when he described the ancient Germans in about the year 100 AD, they're eating meat, milk, and fruit, basically. They're eating like a pastoralist's diet, the kind of diet that the Mongols on the steppe would have eaten, and pastoralist groups ate. So they weren't even really consuming grain. Germans, 2,000 years ago. So for the majority of populations on the planet, then grain-based diets, and that is what a modern diet basically is. If you're eating a kind of modern kind of typical Western diet, you're eating huge amounts of grains, huge amounts of wheat and corn and these kind of industrially produced foodstuffs. And actually, that is totally out of kilter with your genetics, with your ancestral kind of the kind of ancestral template, if you will, for how you should eat. So I just tell people, look, you have to try to eat more like your ancestors. And for some populations, of course, depending on which region of the world you come from, then maybe actually that might mean specific things rather than others, because you can't tolerate grains very well.
Sure.
And in places like the South Pacific, for example, you see massive levels of obesity when Western diets are introduced, Western grain-based diets are introduced, because actually they don't have the genetic adaptations to deal with consuming the levels of carbohydrates that maybe, Westerners do. And so they actually end up being the most obese people in the world. It's not Americans who are the most obese people in the world. It's like it's the population of Vanuatu and these kind of small Pacific nations, because they have no evolutionary history of consuming grains, and then they're just suddenly that's all they're eating.
Yeah, I call it the famous McDonald's effect.
Mm-hmm.
It's a way to so do you think it was incompetence, or perhaps the food industrial complex, so that in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, our famous pyramids were pretty much upside down? Correct? So do you think, and of course I grew up with these pyramids, and so did you, and so did most people that are watching our show today. What What did they get wrong, and why, do you think?
Well, it's interesting. So there's a lot of, with the Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the Make America Healthy Again agenda, there's been a lot of focus on seed and vegetable oils. That's been a big kind of meme, actually, really, um, about Maha. And if you look at the history of seed and vegetable oils, then it's very, very revealing. So up until the beginning of the 20th century, then human beings had no history whatsoever of consuming seed and vegetable oils. Not really. Um, Seed and vegetable oils basically were industrial byproducts that were, I mean, the very first margarine was made from cottonseed oil. So you have a huge cotton industry in the US, and it's producing massive amounts of cotton, and then you have this byproduct from the seeds, which is the oil, and they can't really find anything to do with it. They're using it as a lubricant and as a paint thinner, but they've got massive amounts of cotton seeds and this oil. And so what do they do with it? Well, they say, well, maybe we could make a butter alternative. Maybe we could make a hard fat. And they find this industrial process. They hydrogenate this liquid oil and turn it into a semi-solid fat product, margarine, right? Crisco. Crisco is crystallized cottonseed oil. That's what it's short for. And basically, what you have is around about the kind of 1930s, 1940s, then you have a big push by people like I think it's Procter and Gamble, one of the first real kind of like pioneers of margarine, where they start investing in groups like the American Heart Association. So Procter and Gamble, I think, gave the American Heart Association $1 million in the early 1940s to promote margarine as a healthy alternative to animal fat.
Inflation adjusted, that's a huge number, by the way.
Yeah, that was a lot of money. I mean, the American
Yeah.
Heart Association didn't really figure at all until it got this huge infusion of cash from Procter and Gamble to promote margarine. So you had a lot of, I mean, there was a big industrial push, I think, to sell these kind of novel foodstuffs and in particular processed food as well. And one of the, you have to look at processed food actually, I think, as a vehicle for novel industrial foodstuffs, refined grains, and also these refined fats and new kinds of sort of like refined protein as well, things like soy protein. So yeah, I mean, I think you can very definitely see that there's a big industrial push in the 20th century to create new kinds of shelf stable, convenient foods that use these kind of novel ingredients. There's a big push. There's a big push to sell these, and it transforms the food system. We get
Sure.
the first ultra processed foods, the first kind of modern processed foods in the kind of 1940s, 1950s, marketed on the basis of convenience, especially to housewives. It's like, oh look, you don't have to spend all evening slaving in the kitchen to cook a nice meal for your family. You can buy this meal in a packet, reheat it, and you've got a meal for the family. That's the beginning of this kind of processed food revolution that takes place, and it's all driven by corporations.
Yeah.
Corporations produce processed food.
Yes. So again, you've got the food industrial complex
Mm,
in probably, of course, chasing profits, and there's nothing wrong with profits. I'm a
mm,
big capitalist, and we
sure.
believe in fair markets, but as they're chasing profits, they're finding ways to simplify
Mm,
American lives, and
mm,
in the process, unknowingly perhaps, or maybe knowingly, introducing things into our diets,
mm,
which now, as we look back 50, 60, 70 years later,
mm.
were absolute disasters for our
Yeah,
society.
yeah. I mean, I don't think that you could say, oh well, when Procter and Gamble gave $1 million to the American Heart Association, they were anticipating that 70 years later, 70% of Americans would be overweight and obese. I mean, I don't think anybody had any idea just how catastrophic um, the changes that took place in the 20th century to the food system in the developed world would be. I mean, they certainly knew at least, that previously cottonseed oil and seed and vegetable oils had been good for nothing other than lubricating industrial machinery.
Yeah.
I mean, they
Yeah.
weren't foodstuffs. People
Yeah.
knew that they weren't foodstuffs, but they wanted to market them as foodstuffs. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, you could, a far-sighted person could probably have said, actually, maybe we should stick to eating food rather than industrial lubricant. But and certainly, I think Weston Price, in his book Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, he was talking about, like I said, the very first processed foods, the proto-processed foods, refined grain products, canned fruit, syrups, all this kind of stuff. Like, he could already see that these foods were having a devastating effect on health. They were literally causing the structure of people's bodies to degenerate, most visibly in the face. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm sure that Weston A. Price could have said, look, if we go further down this road, if we go further away from the kind of foods that our ancestors were eating, we're in big trouble. So, I mean, I think you probably could have foreseen it, but I don't think that there was any plan as such. I don't think it's a conspiracy. I just think it's obviously it's corporations pursuing their bottom line, maximizing profits. You have to look as well, I think, at the American system of agriculture and the way that American agriculture developed. So another very, very good book that I would recommend everybody read if they want to understand the state of the food system in America today is Michael Pollan's book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, which is a very, very radical book, actually. It's a quietly radical book. It was a big kind of mainstream hit, but it's basically about why Americans eat so much corn. Because Americans eat huge amounts of corn. Like they say that the Mexicans are the people of corn. But actually, no, it's Americans who are the people of corn. Americans eat the corn today. America is a corn-based empire, far more than the Aztec Empire or the Mayan Empire was. And basically, Michael Pollan is asking, why do Americans eat so much corn? And he looks at the history of the subsidy system in the US. So, basically in the First World War, agricultural production in Europe dropped out. The bottom fell out because Europe's at war.
Sure.
Large parts of northern France, etc., are occupied by warring armies, and they need to increase food production, etc. So American farmers were producing huge amounts of corn, shipping it over to Europe, big captive market. The war ends, and then normality returns. And so what happens? Well, the bottom of the American market drops out. So what does the American government do? It starts to subsidize corn production to protect American farmers. And over the decades, the system of American corn subsidies has mutated into something that it was never intended to be, which is actually basically like, basically it provides incentives for the massive overproduction of corn. You're paying, and corporate producers, corporate agriculture, conglomerates, corporations, whatever, have taken over the production of agriculture in the US. And so what you're doing really is you're subsidizing these massive corporations to produce more and more and more corn that actually people don't really need. Like it's not a system that's being driven by need. It's a system that's taken on its own kind of perverse logic, self-fulfilling kind of logic. And so what happens is, corporate producers have to find somewhere for all of this corn that they're producing to go. So what do? They stick it all in processed food. They create novel food ingredients like high fructose corn syrup.
Of course.
So, high fructose corn syrup was created in the 1970s. I mean, you need an industrial process using enzymes to turn corn syrup into high fructose corn syrup. Developed in the 1970s, I think, with a collaboration between an American and a Japanese company. Anyway, high fructose corn syrup was initially marketed as an alternative to table sugar. So what they were going to do was they were going to take the table sugar out of products and stick high fructose corn syrup in. what actually happened is that they just added high fructose corn syrup on top of all the sugar that was already
Okay.
in products. So Americans, instead of replacing one with the other, they got like a double dose of
Double.
sugar, basically, which is
Yeah.
something that Michael Pollan talks about. And he says, this insinuation of high fructose corn syrup into everything from hot dogs to mustards, to cured ham,
Ketchup.
to everything.
Yep.
It's a massive infusion of empty calories, which he thinks explains, part of the reason why Americans keep getting fatter. But this has also happened as well. It's not just happened with corn; it's also happening with soy. I mean, there's a huge subsidy system as well for the overproduction of soy in the Midwest, and so soybean oil and soy protein are now insinuated into everything as well. So, like all processed food now has soybean oil in it and maybe some soy protein, right? And again, these are novel foodstuffs, novel ingredients. They were never consumed before, not really in any great quantities, but now they're everywhere because of this kind of perverse system of agricultural subsidies that's taken on its own life, that's totally that's totally unattached from the needs of ordinary people and local communities. I mean, it's a very complicated thing talking about, why are people so unhealthy today? It's not, you can't just say it's because people eat too much. Like, there's so much more going on. I mean, there is obviously an element of personal responsibility, and I don't think we should lose that. And that's one of the things that I find quite worrying about these anti-obesity drugs like Wegovy, Ozempic.
That one, sure.
Is that you're taking personal responsibility away from people and saying that actually, weight isn't something you can control without a drug. That's another matter. But like,
we'll discuss that also. We invested in the first way back when the first Bayere, the first GLP-1, but it was for diabetes.
I think those drugs have a use. I think they have.
Sure.
I think they definitely have a use, and there are obviously people who are too fat to lose weight otherwise. But what I worry about is like children being given the drugs and everybody thinking that, well, instead of going to the gym and shifting a few pounds, I'm just going to take a GLP-1 drug. That isn't how they should be used, I don't think.
Definitely. And we're going to see in 10 years some things. I have my own ideas, and that sounds like we're going to have another show on all this. But so it sounds to me like it's almost a tragedy what happened since the 30s to our food system. Probably in concert with nutritionists or nutrition science not doing its job.
No.
Is that a fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I often say, how different would the history of the 20th century and the 21st century have been if Weston A. Price's book had become the basis for nutritional science, if that had been the basis for the approach to what humans should be eating. Oh, let's look at what human beings have ate in the past, and let's look at those groups that have been the healthiest and see what they eat and try and follow them. But instead, we've had a totally different approach that is supposedly informed by science and by experimentation, but is actually manipulated in large part by corporate money and corporate interests. Like I said, you have Procter & Gamble giving the American Heart Association $1 million to promote an oil, a product, margarine, as healthy, that just wasn't healthy. There was no evidence that it was healthy, but they wanted certification from this official, health organization so that they could say to people, don't eat butter, buy Crisco. And that's, so much of nutritional science is gerrymandered in the interests of corporations. That's just absolutely true. It's you can set up a study basically to say anything if you wanted to. If you design a study in a particular way, and because people don't read the fine print. You have to read the fine print. You have to understand what they see the newspaper saying, oh yeah, you need to stop eating meat now because you're going to die. You need to give up eggs. You need to give up milk. You need to be eating plant-based protein. instead.
Or worse yet, the government giving you a pyramid that's absolutely 100%.
Yeah,
I'm going to take us on a quick tangent. I want to come back to food.
sure.
You mentioned soy and corn.
Mm.
Where are you on this whole GMO debate, which comes up every couple of years, at least in the United States.
Mm.
I know, in Europe a lot of times they're
Mm.
banned, but so where do you?
Well, I mean, look, it's undeniable that humans have engaged in genetic engineering since they started selectively breeding animals and crops. I mean, so we have engaged in a kind of crude genetic engineering that actually has benefited mankind for a very long time. You know, like Jersey cows that produce this beautiful, beautiful, fatty, creamy milk that's so delicious. You know, I mean, they are selectively bred to be like that. We have genetically engineered them, albeit in a very crude way, but nevertheless, we have genetically engineered them. But I think this new genetic engineering is much more worrying. In large part because, I mean, one of the things that I think about it is that it's marketed as being very precise. You know, people say, oh, we've got this
Sure.
CRISPR-Cas9 technology and we can, you can cut individual genes and insert them. But actually, we don't really, it's not that precise. We're still using a great big pair of scissors when what we need to be doing is using the finest of scalpels. There are studies, I've seen studies that show that actually you don't make individual cuts with this CRISPR-Cas9 stuff. It actually alters other parts of the genome that you haven't intended to alter. It makes cuts elsewhere, and you end up
Sure.
with other genetic material getting inserted as well. I don't think that we do enough testing of genetically modified products. Feeding tests, where you feed animals for a long time
Yeah.
GMO corn, and you see, well, actually, what happens after, what's it like for an animal to eat GMO corn in the long term? Is it safe? We don't do that
Yeah.
kind of stuff. We rush ahead, and it's dangerous. It's dangerous in
Sure.
various different, not just actually for humans who are consuming it and the animals that are consuming it, but also actually for the broader environment. I mean, we know that
Yeah.
GMO, you get genetic transfer in the wild between GMO crops and non-GMO crops.
Yeah.
And for example, do you want an insecticide resistance gene to be transferred from canola to weeds? Do you want to create super weeds out in the environment? Do you want that
Yeah.
kind of genetic
Yeah.
transfer to take place? And it does. So, I mean, it is a kind of Pandora's box thing, really. I
Yeah.
think that we are dealing with forces that we don't fully understand yet, and because there are these huge corporate interests behind GMO, it's massive business. It's enormous business. I mean,
Oh yeah.
the majority of corn now that is produced in the US is GMO. I mean,
Yeah.
we're talking billions and billions of dollars.
And all soy, all soy.
Yeah, and you've
Right.
rushed ahead with it, and then it's like, okay, well, maybe actually we need to stop. Maybe we need to go back a bit. But then you've got these huge corporations that say, oh, but you're harming our bottom line.
Yeah.
We make campaign donations to you. We expect you to represent our interest.
Sure.
Well, sorry, we can't go back. That's not going to happen. You don't want us to close down our big industrial concern in your constituency, do you?
Sure.
So it's, yeah, I mean, there's an interesting study that I saw a little while ago that actually correlates obesity in the US with GMO corn consumption. There is a
Interesting.
very, very tight correlation between uptake of GMO corn and obesity since about like 1995 or whenever GMO corn really was legalized and really started to be in
And
the
that's
food supply.
GMO corn in all its functions, high fructose,
Yeah.
not just corn, not just the corn that you eat at the cob
Exactly.
at the fair. It's
Yeah.
all the ones
Yeah.
that you mentioned
Yeah.
earlier.
Yeah. It's
Okay.
corn that's in cereal, corn that's
It's in
in
everything. Yeah.
hot dogs, everywhere.
Okay.
And GMO corn has an insecticide. GMO corn has an insecticide gene that has been inserted into it from a I can't remember where it's from, but anyway, it's an insecticide gene. One thing that we know almost uniformly about insecticides and herbicides is that they disrupt the metabolism. That's one of their methods of action, is they disrupt the metabolism. So, whether you're talking about glyphosate or whether you're talking about a natural insecticide like the one that's been stuck in corn. So it's possible that actually, like consumption of GMO corn may be affecting people's metabolism. Like it may be a serious endocrine disruptor. But it just hasn't been investigated sufficiently, and
it won't, because
no.
unfortunately, I think it ends up pitting corporations against people who seem like they're lunatics.
Yes.
It's never the our listeners are, the people who watch our show, who are kind of the wise middle. So it always ends up looking this way, and then the rest of us kind of look, and so I'm gonna go one more thing. I mean, this is fascinating, everything. So the cholesterol theory. So I grew up, I'm older than you, so I remember when they scared me from looking or touching anything that has cholesterol in it. And now that I've followed, they were very wrong. So can you give us a 2-minute cholesterol lesson? Because people still talk about cholesterol and how we shouldn't be eating eggs, specifically to your books. But
yes.
please.
So I mean, cholesterol is essential to life. Cholesterol is well, your brain is 66% cholesterol, I think, or 20% cholesterol, 66% saturated fat, which is made of cholesterol. Cholesterol is essential for life. Cholesterol is the basis of all of the sex hormones, testosterone, estrogen, and the others. Your body produces cholesterol in the liver, but you also have to get it from your diet. And the cholesterol science, the lipid heart hypothesis that suggested that consumption of cholesterol gives you heart disease, which kills you, that was a product, again, of corporate science, corporate-backed science. There was a scientist called Ancel Keys in the 1950s who was given money by the margarine industry to promote the lipid heart hypothesis. At the time, people knew that it was wrong. His fellow scientists criticized him heavily. He was actually kind of ridiculed for it. But because it had the backing of corporations, it eventually became scientific orthodoxy. Eggs have really been subject to assault because they contain a lot of cholesterol. But I've written about this. There was a specific warning against the consumption of eggs that was issued in the mid to late 1960s by Lyndon B. Johnson, and that was because there's actually documentation of this. People were complaining about the price of eggs, and Lyndon B. Johnson said to the Surgeon General, why don't you issue a warning about the cholesterol in eggs to stop people buying them? I mean, that's actually documented. So I mean, there's been a war on cholesterol for 70 or so years. It's been a product of this transformation of the food supply by corporations. There was very little evidence to support it in the beginning, and now, thankfully, there's actually a lot of evidence against it. There's the USDA, for example, for 60, 70 years used to issue cholesterol guidelines, and it used to say, daily you shouldn't exceed this amount of cholesterol. Well, in 2015, the USDA silently dropped their recommendations for dietary cholesterol consumption. So not even the USDA recommends limiting your cholesterol intake anymore. So
I personally, eggs are one of my big staples. So great segue into your books. And I do want to talk a little bit about the testosterone issue as well. But so into your books, but specifically, if you were recommending to our listeners and viewers, how should you change their food based on the books that you have? And feel free to promote your books as well. I think this is a great time.
Yeah, of course. Well, like I said with Weston A. Price, I think that you need to build your diet around nutrient-dense animal foods. That's the first thing you should do. And I mean, especially if you're a man and you're looking to increase your testosterone, which is the master male hormone. I mean, testosterone is, everything, no, not quite everything, but a
Sure.
lot of things about being a man, masculine health revolves around testosterone, and you want to improve your testosterone levels. In part because the modern world is kind of like, it's pretty toxic to testosterone actually, and we're exposed to all of these harmful chemicals that actually reduce testosterone, and diet isn't optimal, and we don't get enough sleep, and we're stressed, etc. So if you build your diet around nutrient dense animal foods, you will improve your hormonal health. You'll be in a position to build more muscle mass. So yes, I mean, my broad recommendation about diet is just look, get some really good quality animal foods in your life. That doesn't mean that you can't eat grains. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't eat vegetables or fruit. But I just think that if you make nutrient dense animal foods the cornerstone of your diet,
Yeah.
especially if they're not already, especially if you're like a semi-vegetarian or whatever, or even, God forbid, a vegan, if you actually become someone who is committed to high quality animal foods, you can change your life. I mean, you need to exercise as well, of
Sure,
course,
sure.
and it would be good to improve your sleep. I mean, sleep is
Yeah.
a big thing, but yeah, nutrient dense animal foods, if you can incorporate them into your diet regularly, maybe a bit of organ meat sometimes, once a week or something, but fatty cuts of meat, eggs,
All right.
dairy, etc. You can have an incredible effect on your health, an incredible effect
So
on your health.
two very quick things. First of all, I want to clarify something on testosterone. A lot of people
Mm,
associate in society testosterone with libido, which
mm,
no, it's a male hormone. It's a feel good hormone. I can do
mm,
my extra set at the gym hormone. I
yeah.
feel better about life hormone. My cortisol goes down. So
Mm,
I don't want people to think, oh, these two guys are talking about. It's not. That's not what it's about. So it's really really important. And then I just want to make sure to clarify this, so you and I don't look like we're too we're promoting other things.
mm,
So that that to me is very important. On the diet, I think I have anecdotes, and I'm sure so do you, about people who
mm,
actually eat only meats, but a little bit. A lot of people tell me they're lactose intolerant, and you were just
mm.
mentioning cheese. What? How do we convince them that, or maybe it's something we can't do anything about, but is there something we could do something about, because that is a big issue with a lot of people.
Well, lactose intolerance is an interesting thing because Europeans, people of European descent, so Europeans in
Yeah.
America, as a population, have the highest levels of lactose tolerance in the world. I mean,
Okay.
Europeans are the people who are most well equipped to deal with lactose. A
Okay.
lot of people of European descent who think they're lactose intolerant aren't. What they're actually intolerant to is some of the nasty additives that are put in modern dairy products. So, for example, homogenized milk, the kind of bog standard milk that you get in the supermarket, right, has substances added to it to thicken it and to hold it together. Um, Things like, for example, carrageenan, which is a seaweed derivative, right? And carrageenan is a nasty substance. It's used in laboratory experiments to induce tumors in rodents. It's an inflammatory substance.
Okay.
You give rodents carrageenan, and you can reliably give them cancer, basically.
Yeah.
And there are other substances like carrageenan that are also added to milk as well, and
Okay. Okay.
it ends up in cheese as well. So I would say, for example, say with milk, if you think you're lactose intolerant, try some raw milk, try some unhomogenized raw milk,
Well, yeah.
and see if it has the same effect on you. I would wager money that it wouldn't, and I would wager that you are not lactose intolerant. What you are is you just don't like the stuff that's put in modern dairy. But
Okay.
if you are lactose intolerant, if you actually are lactose intolerant, then yeah, I mean, don't eat things that make you feel bad and have a negative effect on your health and digestion. Like
Sure.
that's a good principle in general. Like, not all foods work for everybody. So if dairy doesn't work for you, if it upsets your stomach, if it gives you diarrhea and gas and whatever, just don't eat it, because there are
Yeah.
other ways that you can get high quality protein. I mean, dairy, milk, It's a tremendous source of protein, highest quality protein, fats, vitamins, minerals. I mean, it's great to drink milk. It's delicious and it's also very good for you. But if it doesn't work, don't stress about it.
Okay.
That's what I would
Well,
say.
the U.S. is full of stories. Friends of mine and people that I know who, they're lactose intolerant, they're
Mm,
gluten intolerant in the United States. They go to Spain,
mm,
and nothing is wrong with them. So
yeah,
there's definitely
true.
your point here is very, very good. So I'm going to move you to your next subject that I know you're very passionate about, which is the boys and testosterone and what's happening in our society,
Mm,
especially in the developed world.
mm,
I think you have been a strong advocate for boys, and I have two daughters, but I was a boy myself, and
mm,
we get in fist fights in school all the time.
mm,
That's what we do. We like to play with guns. So.
mm,
And I know that was a big topic of your Tucker Carlson interview as well.
mm.
Can you? I know that's a whole other episode we could do, but can you just tell us in 5, 10 minutes? I know that's an important subject for you.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So testosterone is, and testosterone decline in particular, the implications of testosterone decline is the main subject, was the main subject of the Tucker Carlson documentary I was in, and it's the main subject of my new book, The Last Men. So, I mean, year on year across the Western world, it looks like there has been a 1% testosterone decline. So it doesn't sound like very much, but cumulatively over decades, half a century, that's a lot. I mean, testosterone levels are plummeting. And that has all sorts of implications. I mean, not only does it mean in some very real sense that men are
Yeah,
not as masculine as they were,
yeah,
because testosterone is the master male hormone. The
sure.
difference between men and women is in the ratios of testosterone to estrogen. Men have much more testosterone, much less estrogen.
That's it.
Women have much more estrogen and much less testosterone. You know, your testosterone governs the process by which a fetus becomes a boy, or becomes a male fetus, and then a male baby, and then you become a boy, and then you become a man. Testosterone is essential to that entire process, and so any kind of disruption to natural testosterone levels is going to have profound effects to the individual, but it also has profound effects on society, I think. I mean, one of the most profound effects is in terms of fertility. So, this testosterone decline is part of a much broader precipitous decline in fertility. So, not only have testosterone levels declined, but sperm counts and sperm quality. So sperm quality is basically like the ability of a sperm to swim properly. You know,
Mm-hmm.
so if the sperm quality decreases, then sperm are less viable. Basically, like they
Yeah,
don't do what they should do. They don't swim in the
to
right
do their job.
direction. They
Sure.
don't fertilize an egg. So year on year, we're seeing these enormous declines in sperm counts and sperm quality. One reproductive health expert, Professor Shanna Swan, she's been on Joe Rogan. She wrote a book in, I think, 2022 called Countdown, about reproductive decline and in particular sperm count decline. She's predicted that by 2045, the median man will have a sperm count of 0. And what that means is that one half of all men will produce no sperm at all, none whatsoever, and
Yeah,
the other half will produce so few that they might as well produce none. They're not going to get anybody pregnant. Um, uh, so, this testosterone decline is bound up in this kind of broader reproductive health decline that could actually threaten the future of the species. But then we could get into the kind of political implications too of what does it mean if men, and the social implications. What does it mean if men can't be men anymore? What does it mean if we're kind of converging on this sort of androgynous ideal, where men aren't men
women.
and
Oh,
women
yeah.
aren't really women either, and so there's all sorts of things to unpick here. You could talk about transgenderism as well. I mean, one of the main causes of this testosterone decline, this fertility decline, is exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals, these harmful industrial
Yeah.
chemicals that are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. They're everywhere because of personal care products, herbicides, pesticides, industrial runoff, food additives,
Mhm.
plastics in particular. It seems that like plastics can't be manufactured without these chemicals that are these industrial chemicals, phthalate, bisphenol A, PFAS, that are endocrine disruptors that disrupt
Yeah.
hormonal function. But what's also been shown is that actually there is a link between exposure to these endocrine disrupting chemicals and transgenderism and manifestation of gender dysphoria, for example.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of stuff going on. I mean, we really are seeing a kind of it is a health crisis. It is a health crisis, and what I think is important, actually, I mean, in America,
Yeah.
you're lucky because you have someone now in charge of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who understands all of this. He was in that Tucker Carlson documentary with me about testosterone decline. He
Yeah.
understands what it is, what it means, and also what's causing it. And so I think actually you have a chance to address it finally, because it's been happening for decades. The groundwork was laid early in the 20th century. New industrial processes,
Sure.
new chemicals, new products, commercial products, consumer products, plastics in particular, and now it's all really starting to come to a head. And yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
testosterone decline is not ephemeral. It's not ephemeral, and that's what the Tucker Carlson documentary was about, and it's what my book is about as well. I try to lay out the fact.
Okay.
I try to
Yeah.
lay out the fact that actually, testosterone decline is a civilizational problem, and it's a civilizational problem not just because we could end up in a position where we can't reproduce very soon, but also because it has broader political implications. It has
Of
implications
course.
about society
Across the
and
board.
politics. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Is there an equivalent for women? Are hormonal issues that are happening? Because I
Mm,
think the testosterone issue is very, very serious and very, very concerning,
mm,
especially that it tends to be a developed world problem.
yes.
So, and again, we can talk about all the geopolitical implication of just that. But is there
Mm,
something that's happening on the woman's side that can
yes.
be considered equivalent given the,
Mm,
the foods and, and,
sure.
and
Mm.
medicines and so on?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, it's worth saying that testosterone is essential to women's health as well. It's
That's true,
it's
yeah.
it's essential to women's health in a smaller quantity, but it's essential, and in fact, estrogen too is essential to male health. So, um, if you have an estrogen deficiency as a man, you can have all sorts of problems. I mean, you'll have libido problems, for example. I mean, estrogen is implicated in erectile function, for example.
Hmm.
And so, if you have low estrogen, you might not be able to
Yeah.
get an erection. But yeah, I mean, with women, then the most important hormone is the estrogen, which they have in a much greater quantity relative to testosterone than men do. And these chemicals, these industrial chemicals, these endocrine disruptors, broadly speaking, they are estrogenic. So what they do is they mimic the effects of the hormone estrogen in the human body. So it's like an infusion of artificial estrogen, basically.
Okay.
But that's bad for women too, because that also upsets the ratio between estrogen to testosterone. So the ratio is important. Like, it's not the case that if you're a woman, you should have, infinity estrogen and zero testosterone, and
Awesome.
as a
Yeah.
man, you should have infinity testosterone and zero estrogen. The ratio is important. And so if women have too much estrogen in their body, if they're constantly being battered and kind of absorbing all of this estrogen from the environment, from the food, from the water, from personal care products, etc., that has very negative effects on their health too. So the growth of things like, of conditions like endometriosis, for example, polycystic ovarian
Yeah.
syndrome, miscarriages, particular forms of breast cancer, uterine cancer, vaginal cancer. These are all linked to exposure to harmful endocrine disrupting chemicals, these estrogen
Yeah.
mimickers. So, I mean,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean
It's
it's a problem for
across.
men. It's a problem for
Yeah,
women too. So it's
yeah.
and this is something that I try to emphasize in my work as well. Is that like, look, this isn't just a man's issue. Like this is actually this is for man and woman. We're in this problem together, and that's why we need to sort it out.
Well, it's a perfect time for you had mentioned the Maha movement, and
Mm.
it's a perfect time for me to recognize the Maha moms
Hmm.
because they are the ones who are fighting for their boys now. Of course, they're
Mm.
children, but
Yeah.
there's something for me, again, everything we try to do on our show is to make people understand the issues so they
Mm.
can make their own minds. There's something for me that's really important about these moms that are realizing that,
Mm.
hey, don't put my boy on ADD drugs when they're
Mm.
8 years old because they got in a fight at school.
Yeah.
So
Mm.
it's something that I'm we've been fortunate in the United States, and I'm hoping that it's a little bit of a dominoes effect, so that
Yeah.
the rest of
Yeah.
the
Me too.
Western world, we're seeing it in Europe already a little bit,
Mm.
little tricks here and there in France and Germany and so on, and we'll see what happens with you guys in the UK.
Hmm.
Um, but I think there is finally a counter movement
Mm.
to 100 years of
Mm.
misguided industrialization of
Mm.
food and all of the effects that that's had on us as human beings. Again, metabolic disease crisis in the United States,
Mm.
like the world's never
Yeah.
seen. And of course, all of the social issues and political issues that come out of that.
Mm.
So hopefully, help is on the way. And I've it's ironic because I have been a biotech investor and a medtech
Mm.
investor my whole career, and I
Mm.
always did it with the best of intentions. But
Mm.
also watching like you're saying the GLP ones and everything that's happening, it's not gastroparesis is not a good thing.
No.
Okay,
No.
I don't care what
No.
they tell me and how good you look and how much weight you've lost. By the way, they don't lose muscle, and I can't believe we haven't even talked a little bit about the. So we're gonna have to do a bodybuilding episode at
Yeah, we
some point
should. Yeah, we
and
should.
biohacking. But
Mm.
uh, in conclusion, this was so helpful. It's going to be very, very good for our audience. And again, you were great at simplifying. Again, to us, it's always about taking these complex
Mm.
issues and making them so that everybody,
Yeah.
people are going to walk away from this show, I believe, with such a better understanding of so many things. So I
Hmm.
really want to thank you for that, and I do promise I do want to have another one. I think
Yeah,
I
we
mean
should.
I'm looking at your guns and I'm like we got to talk about that too. Okay, so thank you so much. It was a pleasure, and
Likewise.
we will be in touch again to do this. Any
Fantastic.
any
Thank you.
any any words of wisdom in conclusion?
I would just say, actually, look, if you're looking to transform your life, then just start small. Okay, like make some small changes, make some changes to your diet, start exercising, try to improve your sleep, and very soon that change will be cumulative. Change really is a positive change has a kind of snowball effect, right? You make little changes and they just accumulate and accumulate, and within 6 months or a year, suddenly you're an unrecognizable person. So just be humble, start small, and if you look after the small things, the big things will take care of themselves.
So I borrow from two places. One of them is one step at a time, and in Italian, piano piano. All right, thank you so much.